There we go. So, hello everyone. My name is Mackenzie Garrity, and I am the CCO of Articheck, which is a digital condition reporting platform. Now, today we're going to be talking a little bit more generally about digital condition reporting, um, and more specifically about risk management in condition reporting, and some important things to look out for, some important things to think about when you're thinking about your risk management strategy and why it isn't complete without considering condition reporting as well. So I want to make sure that everybody feels like they are getting their questions answered. So if you have any questions as we go, or you have anything that you'd like to add, please feel free to use the chat. If it's a question that I'm going to get the answer to in a little bit, then I'll let you know. And if it's something that I can answer for you in that moment, then I will make sure I do so. And then at the end, I'll also try to leave a little bit of time for question and answer. But I also will just hang out a little bit past the hour to make sure that everyone gets any questions answered if needed. So let's jump in. So today we're going to talk about risk management and specifically how digital condition reporting can impact your organization's cybersecurity, sustainability, and team efficacy. Okay, in the terms of risk management. So first, let's all go on the same page about risk management, because I think this is sort of a concept that is thrown around a lot, right? And isn't necessarily, always so clear about what exactly are we talking about when we're talking about risk management. Okay, so, I think it's almost a term that loses meaning at a certain point. So let's look at it from, kind of the ground up. So if we're thinking about risk management and we look directly at this particular environment, okay, so we have a dam that is above a river and then a town. Okay, so what could potentially happen here that, let's say, would be bad, right? What sort of issues could occur in this particular scenario? If anyone wants to pop into the chat and just give a shout out. I know this isn't directly art related, but I promise it will apply as we move forward. So what could happen here in this particular scenario that would be, a negative outcome, negative issue? Flood. Yeah, exactly. So we have a threat, right? What we're worried about that could potentially be happening, right, is a flood. So the dam breaking. Okay. So a threat is when the dam cracks, right? Or the dam stops working in one way or another that could lead to a flood, right? So you've actually gotten one step ahead of me, right? And we're talking about the harm that could be caused, right? Which is that the town gets flooded. And then the threat, which is that the dam is cracked. And so what's the potential risk that we're looking at here, right? So the harm is that the town is flooded, okay? The threat is that crack, but the dam hasn't actually broken yet, right? So that consequence hasn't happened yet. So what we actually have to look at is what are the potential risks in this scenario? And it's that the dam, this crack turns into an actual break in the dam, and then a large amount of water goes downstream and causes harm, right? Causes a flood. So in this scenario, there's really one major risk that we're concerned about, which is the flood. But in other scenarios, we're actually going to be looking at multiple risks, right? And so with condition reporting, we're actually looking at addressing risks across multiple different departments, across multiple different, kind of types of scenarios, right? And so just going back up here to what we're going to be talking about, we're talking about cybersecurity, we're talking about sustainability and team efficacy. So cybersecurity and sustainability are, two very different topics that both have essentially the threats can be similar and some of the harms can be similar, but the actual risks, what could happen, might be very different, right? So it may not be a flood, it may be something else that occurs that causes the same consequence, okay? Causes the same harm. So we have a couple ways that we could look at risk management strategy. One is, okay, we already have our threat here. We already have this crack in the dam, and we're going to patch it up, right? Our second is that we're going to actually completely replace that piece of our workflow to make sure that it's never going to break, right? So that we make the crack go away entirely by replacing that piece. Or in advance of the threat even occurring, we prevent it from happening, right? So we're going to talk about all three of those scenarios. So it's, is there already a threat that's happening that we need to address immediately, right? Is there a threat that could happen, right? That we need to completely, that we could avoid by replacing that piece of our protocol? Or is there a threat that's already happening that, again, we could then get rid of by replacing that piece of our protocol? So we're going to talk about cybersecurity first. So here are some cybersecurity concerns that we have, right? Now, I think the big one that everyone kind of says is theft. But in fact, on a day-to-day basis, right, that's probably not the one that we're most worried about in terms of cybersecurity. There's a lot of smaller concerns that we might be worried about in terms of cybersecurity that come up that's not just about theft, or that might be related to not just theft of the object itself, but theft of information, right? Which we also wouldn't want about that particular object. So things that could lead to fraud, whether that's copying objects, or adding or deleting information, monetary loss, so institutional funds in some way, whether that's because of cybersecurity, kind of basic cybersecurity concerns, like, again, information that's being stolen or objects that are being stolen, or whether that's inefficient processes that lead to cybersecurity issues and therefore loss of time, loss of money, etc. And then, of course, loss of control, right? So someone hacks into the system that you're using in one way or another, and you're not able to do the work that you need to do. So I think one really big one that comes up a lot in discussions that I have with museums that isn't something that's necessarily known is something that I'd recommend to everyone in this room, anybody who deals with loans, is to check your insurance policy. Because what you'll find is that in every insurance policy out there, there's going to be some pretty vague language in there about cybersecurity, okay? And what it says in essence, and what I found out by working with insurers and working with museums, is that actually by using insecure methods and tools, you put insurance claims at risk. And so what that means is that if you're filing an insurance claim, that the reason for the claim is some cybersecurity. Okay, so it's let's say you used a PDF that was edited, and so the actual condition for your condition report, and so the actual condition of that piece was not properly communicated, and so the work wasn't handled properly, and it was broken, and so then you're putting through an insurance claim. If the insurer can see in the workflow that the reason for that is because the PDF was edited, which is an insecure piece of technology, then they can actually deny your claim on the basis of cybersecurity. Okay, and so this is something that we didn't even know about until probably about this last year when we started working a lot more with insurers. But you can actually have claims denied due to simply the technology that you're using in order to communicate information and whether that technology is secure or not. So that's something definitely to look at, to check your policies about. And that's something that digital condition reporting avoids, right? You're not dealing with that issue anymore. So a big one that I think most of us are probably doing right now is sharing information via email. Sharing information via email is one of the biggest cybersecurity risks that you can run into. And there's a number of reasons for this. Number one is actually this last point, which is that it's the most hacked method of communication on the internet. So email is essentially an open method of communication. So you have to log into your inbox to get to your email. The other person has to log into their inbox to get to their email. But when the email is in the middle, when it's between those two inboxes, it's completely accessible by anybody who knows how to get to an email that's in the air. Okay, so it is the most hacked method of communication, and so it's really important not to use it for key information. Then you have PDFs and images easily altered by others. So PDFs, right, originally, and the reason we use them so much for condition reporting is because they are originally developed as being a type of communication that was uneditable, or at least you would be able to see if it was edited. Now that's no longer the case. So even now, if you try to submit like evidence of identity to banks, they won't accept PDFs in cases where you're dealing with sensitive and super sensitive information. I actually had this come up with our business bank the other day because PDFs are now so easily altered, right, by anybody. And so when we're talking about digital condition reporting, it used to be, right, that a PDF would be a secure way to do condition reporting and in digital space, and no longer is it, considered on that list. So that's something that we need to look at. We also need to look at the fact that, when you send something via email, it can be shared without your knowledge. So it's really, if you're sending a PDF to someone via email, you have to accept that that PDF could go to anybody, anywhere, and you would have no knowledge of it. Okay, so what can I do right now? I've given you, some big problems that we might be able to deal with here. So let's talk about how we can deal with them. Okay, so the first one is to send sensitive data in a secure way. Okay, so we want data to be sent confidentially, with integrity and with availability. So we want to make sure it's always available to the person that needs it, but it's sent in a way that is secure and also confidential in the sense that it can't be forwarded on to someone else, right? So like we said, email is one of the most easily hacked forms of communication, so we're not going to be using email. We're also not going to be using PDFs because the content can be changed, manipulated once it's sent, and information can be taken out of context. So what are we going to be doing instead? We're going to be using the cloud. Okay, so sometimes you have to let go of perceived control in order to improve security. This is kind of a bit of a saying in the cybersecurity space. So how can you send data securely? Well, you can do it using authentication and access using the cloud. Okay, now why is that, right? Why is it that the cloud is better than email? It's because instead of you sending a file, right, via an unsecure tunnel, right? So one email inbox here, the other email inbox here, and in the middle, it's completely insecure. Anyone can grab it from the air, right? You actually have one central space that you're giving someone else access to, right? Like a lockbox, like a safe. And you are giving someone else the password to that. And the password to that is something that only they can access, right? So you're not just sending them a password, right? You're sending them, and we're going to talk about this in a minute. You're sending them a way to access that safe with that important information inside of it in a way that only they can do it. And so, how can only they do it, right? You're not just sending them a password in the email that says 123, because again, emails can be pulled out of the air, right? So if we're talking about that, then we're looking at two-factor authentication, and this is key, right? You can't just have sending something via the cloud, right? Just sharing a file in a Dropbox that they can download, right? That's only half of the picture. The other half of the picture is how do they actually access that file when they click on that link in their email inbox? And the answer to that is two-factor authentication. So anyone who's heard of two-factor authentication? Feel free to raise your hand, or it's something that you've used before. I'm sure all of you have used at some point or another, right? Even for personal purposes. So usernames and passwords can be easily hacked. So not only should you not send passwords via email, right? So, hey, you can log into this using, password 123, but usernames and passwords can be easily hacked. So even if you said, okay, please access this in Dropbox, here's the link, that's only one level of protection, because if someone hacks their email, they very likely will then be able to hack that password. Okay. So we also, easily memorable passwords are insecure. I kept saying password 123. And then also, in a lot of cases, people reuse passwords across the board. So two-factor authentication is actually where you both log in using the username and password, and then you have that information sent somewhere else. That software sends a code somewhere else in order to double check that it's you, right? And in a lot of cases, it'll be your email, right? To make sure that it's not just someone signing in with username and password into that software, but also they have access to the email inbox. Sometimes it's a mobile text message. Sometimes it's a mobile app ping. Sometimes it's something that's coming through on a different software. So there's a lot of different ways to do this. But it's very important to make sure that using two-factor authentication to protect valuable information, and condition reports are valuable information. So obviously we're using Zoom at the moment, okay, but we're using this for public information. So there's a lot of institutions that have gotten used to, especially during the pandemic, using WhatsApp, using Zoom, and using email for the purposes of communication about condition in various scenarios and various circumstances. So we have here, we just talked about two-factor authentication, right? So why does this matter, right? Well, there's been mass password breaches for a lot of different systems. For digital condition reporting, it's required, okay? So for a system like GardaCheck, two-factor authentication is built into the system. For WhatsApp, for Zoom, for email, it's not required. You also have authorized sharing, right? So this is what we're talking about, sharing via the cloud, okay? So having that one central safe location rather than sending information back and forth in an exposed space. So digital condition reporting has a closed system that shares via custom linking and can only be opened by the intended recipient. WhatsApps can be opened by anyone if they're forwarded. Zooms, can be opened by anyone. They have access to it, the recording or the password, right? And same with email. They can be shared with anyone, be forwarded to anyone. We then have data ownership. Okay, so data ownership is another asset of this. Sensitive data needs to be owned and controlled by the lending institute or the responsible party. So you want to make sure that you are controlling your data. And so that's why we were saying before, right? With an email, anyone can forward that on to anybody. And you don't actually own that information once you send it to someone via email, once you send that PDF to someone via email, with that Word document to someone via email, that no longer belongs to you, right? We would hope it would, right? But in actuality, it doesn't belong to us anymore because that has open access to anybody who receives it. So data, and it's not just about institutions, partner institutions forwarding it on to somebody else, whether on purpose or an accident. An email, that happens, all the time, right? Things can be forwarded on purpose or an accident. But on WhatsApp and Zoom, your data is even shared with third parties, right? For the purposes of advertising. So that's not great. For digital condition reporting, client data remains the property of the client as per the T&Cs, right? And so you like from the beginning that the data that you have there, and client data, for example, in Museum Plus or Art Plus, whichever one of those that you're using, is also your property, right? So that's something that you want to make sure is happening across the board when you're thinking about any type of data that is integral to your institution, which includes data about your collection and the condition of it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about risk management in the context of sustainability. So I think we've all heard of, the EU Climate Target Plan, the 2030 Paris Accords, et cetera, et cetera. These kind of different, you know, terms get bounced around a lot. And we're all supposed to be cutting our greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030. But I think that on kind of a lower level, how do we do this, right? We have 7 years to do this, and that's not actually that much time. So how can we do this? Well, first we have to figure out like what is the biggest contributor to the organization's carbon footprint. Okay, so we have things like staff travel, we have things like shipping, we have our buildings, right? These are some of the most kind of obvious ones. So what does everybody think, of these, whether it's staff travel, shipping of objects, or buildings, which is the biggest contributor to an organization's carbon footprint? Give a guess. Of these three, is it staff travel? Is it shipping? Is it buildings? Or do you think it's something else? Maybe not on this list, but it's one of these three. Staff travel, shipping, or buildings? Buildings. Interesting. Okay. So couriers are actually approximately 75% of an exhibition's movement carbon footprint. Okay. So actually all three of these contribute just about equally. So it is a bit of a trick question. All of these contribute just about equally to an organization's carbon footprint: staff travel, shipping, and buildings. Now, how we do shipping is a more complicated question. How we work on buildings is something that can be managed with digital condition reporting. And if you're interested in talking about that, there's actually a program that's going on right now with Key Culture for museums that would like to try to reduce their climate controls. So that's something we're happy to we're introduce you to them if that's something you'd like to look into. And then staff travel, which is what I'm going to be focusing on now. So 75% of an exhibition's movement carbon footprint is going to be staff travel, okay? And staff travel is about a third of an organization's carbon footprint. That's a lot, right? Now, we definitely are, I think a lot of us are moving back into into staff travel, whether that's locally or long distance for the purposes of exhibitions and loans. Now, in a recent case study that was done with the Frida Kahlo exhibition in 2018, the emissions from couriers were actually 3 times more than air and road freight combined. So although, if you're looking at staff travel, shipping, and buildings, approximately these can contribute equally, right? In fact, the courier was the biggest chunk of these exhibitions, right? And this is often when you have works that are coming from the US, North America to Europe, and vice versa, right? Or Asia to Europe and vice versa. And so in these cases, the courier actually tends to be the biggest cost in carbon and in cash. So we're going to kind of look at that and see how we can reduce that risk. Okay, so if we already have a threat, right? We already have our threat of staff travel. We already know that this is what is causing our problem. This is what's costing us carbon. This is what's costing us cash and time, right? Then what are we able to do in order to reduce that? Well, there's a couple things. The first is implementing remote collaboration oversight where possible. Okay, so something that we just talked about when we were talking about cybersecurity was sharing things via the cloud. Okay, so that allows for remote collaboration. It allows for multiple people to be working on the same document with a trail of with a legally verifiable audit trail, so you know who's working on which piece and when, and oversight where possible, right? So you actually want to be able to see from remote if you're not there, right? If you decide, okay, we're not going to actually travel with this object, what are we going to do in order to oversee it? Well, we're probably going to want to have videos and photos and reports that show, where the work is and how it's being installed and packed and tracked. And then for that purpose, video comes into play. So video is really helpful. The addition of video, right, beyond photo is really helpful when you're looking at reducing that staff travel. It's one of the tools that we can use in order to patch that threat, right, or reduce that threat. And then we have one device for everything. Okay, so this is where, if we are thinking about staff travel, and even if you think about staff travel on a really local level, okay, so you're going back and forth from, let's say, 2 different locations in one city, right? If you have to go back to the office location from the exhibition location every time you need to be working on condition reports because you need to go back to a computer that you're using out at your office location versus the exhibition location, that's costing you carbon and cash, right? Now that's on a low level, but at the same time, everything makes a difference. And so if we're looking at that, having one device for everything, having one device with you physically, a mobile device to be able to do everything. So to be able to take the pictures, to be able to do the reporting, to be able to share the reports, really gives you the ability to save carbon and cash. Okay, so this is a case study from CODA, the museum in Bergen. And they actually did a big security upgrade. They used digital condition reporting in order to not only do their basic condition reports, but also to do videos for different steps in the transit of the object so that they could watch that happening, and different steps of the installation of the packing of the objects. They were using digital condition reporting. You can see here, for example, like vehicle loading, vehicle unloading, aircraft loading. And you see this, 82 objects were in question for this particular exhibition. And they saved 50 tons of carbon, which is quite a lot, and $57,000 on this one exhibition, right? Which is a big chunk of change, right? That could go towards other things. So the last thing that we're going to talk about is going to be team efficacy. So team efficacy concerns. We're going to talk about speed, collaboration, and future access. Okay. So when I say efficacy, I mean, in the invite, we just kind of referred directly to time, or the first one, which is speed. But when you're talking about a team's efficacy, you're also looking at how well they're able to work together, and then also how well the future team, right, essentially gets to work with a past team. So if you have team members who are trying to work with records, how are they doing that, and how well is that happening? So if we're thinking about speed, one of the things for speed, right, is knowing immediately everything that you can about an object's condition in one go, right? Rather than having to do a condition report from scratch and figure it out by yourself, reading one condition report from the past that you might be able to find, but not all of them, right? Maybe reading just someone's notes, right? Or something in another language. You want to be able to have all of that information available to you in one go, in convertible into all the languages, right? So that you really can do things as quickly as possible. You also want to look at the number of steps to completion. So currently, think about the number of steps to completion that you have for doing condition reports in full. So from the moment that you're examining the object all the way through to the reports getting updated, when the object comes back from a loan. So when we think about those types of steps, we're particularly thinking about where are those steps happening, in what maybe softwares are they happening in, on what devices are they happening on. So does anyone want to give me an example of a step that they're taking right now that maybe they'd like to get rid of? Maybe feels like an extra step. So are you taking pictures on a camera and then having to upload those? Are you having to convert file types? Are you using multiple different softwares, multiple different devices? Are you having to repeat condition reports and the actual material, the actual data that goes into them? So what steps to completion can you think of right now for your condition reporting process that you have? Go ahead and pop it into the chat. Think of a step or a couple of steps that you have currently right now that in your current process are vital. You couldn't skip it, right? Ah, yes, physical copies of the report going with the loan. This is a big one. And that's not even a cybersecurity risk, but just a security risk. I can see, yes, cost time and nerves. I like the addition of nerves. I'm sorry to hear that. It is stressful, right? Yes, physical copies of the report. I've even heard of physical copies of the report going on the outside of crates, which seems like it's saving time, right, at that moment. But in reality is a huge security risk because you know exactly what's in that box. Anyone who's looking at that crate anywhere in the vicinity of the transit locations, like the airport or the road transit. Anyone else have any steps to completion for condition reporting that they're using right now? Any softwares that they find to be frustrating to use or feel like have a lot of steps? I know uh, there was an institution that before they were using Articheck that I spoke with, they were using Microsoft Paint in order to do kind of mock-ups of annotations. And the amount of time it was taking them was, you know, 10 times the amount of time that it should be using for that. Okay, so I see everyone's a bit in listening mode, so I'm happy to move forwards. So we have duplication of effort, right? Which definitely relates to speed. Do we want to be doing things double, right? So we, on our end, when we're, let's say, borrowing something, right? Do you do another condition report from the individual who, from the institution that shared from you? Are you doing a condition report from scratch when something arrives to your institution for an exhibition? Is the other institution doing another condition report from scratch when something arrives to them, right? So not only internally duplication of effort, right, where you're repeating steps whenever you're doing condition reports, but also duplication of effort between institutions, right? When you're looking at exhibitions, can we not just look at ourselves as the team of our museum, but the team of the entire exhibition that's going forward? And then, of course, when we're looking at speed, we're looking at standardization, right? So when you follow a process, if it is if it works the same every time and you don't have to remember the steps of that process, right? That makes it a lot faster. So if you're writing a condition report and you have to write it from scratch using a fairly vague template every time, right? And you have to remember all of the different types of annotations that you might want to add. That takes up speed for a team, right? It literally takes up brain space for you. And so instead, if you have the ability to pick from a drop down, you know, what type of damage you're annotating on that particular piece, that standardization, rather than needing to remember from a list in your head, okay, which of these 50 different damage types am I annotating right now? That standardization saves you speed and nerves, right? As the museum, well, honestly, I'm sorry, my German is not the best. So as the MF Museum just mentioned. And then we have collaboration. So collaboration relates to team efficacy and risk management in a number of ways, right? So we have both sharing internally and externally. So we want to make sure that in terms of risk, right, we are sharing in a way that is not going to lead to theft, right, which is a big one. But what we're really thinking about here on a day-to-day basis is communication and clear communication, right? When we're collaborating internally and especially externally, we want to collaborate in a way where we're having clear communication. So are they receiving all the information that they need that relates to condition, and not just in a traditional sense, right? Not just in a traditional sense of the, the condition of the work in the past, but also how to keep the piece in proper condition, right? Which is something that we often put into condition reports, but we don't really think about as being something that relates to future condition, right? So for example, if you put a note in there that says like must be handled with gloves, right? Something really simple like that. We all do that, right? In our condition reports, we all put notes like that in there about, kind of packing and handling requirements. That is not only giving instructions on what it should look like at this moment, but also how to prevent future condition issues, right? And in order to do that most effectively, we need to have clear communication, right? We need to make sure we're communicating clearly. And the best way to do that is probably to be working off of the same document. And so if you're sending physical copies, or if you're sending PDFs, if you're sending Word documents via email, then you're not actually working off of the same copy anymore, right? You're working off of an outdated copy. And so let's say you forgot to add something, or they forgot to add something, they then need to send through another one. And the more sort of, PDFs you're juggling, the more physical copies that you're playing with, the more risk you're dealing with, right? The more risk you're adding to the situation. Because do they open email 1 or email 2? The one that has the correct instructions or the wrong instructions and how to handle this piece? Just because, you were in a rush and trying to document the correct handling of 50 different pieces, and you copy pasted the correct handling for piece number 49 into the condition report for piece number 48, right? Why add that risk? Why don't we just avoid that altogether by working on the same document in the same software at all times? Standardization, again, comes through for collaboration, right? We all use different terms, especially when we're working in different languages, for the purposes of damages. And so what if we had one set of damage types that was the same in every language and was just translated between the languages? That would be a huge time saver, right? In terms of even just understanding, like, okay, does this mean what I think it means in English, or does it mean what they think it means in English, right? And even if you're looking at the differences in English between the UK and the US, sometimes we have damage types or annotation types that are going to be slightly different. Or perhaps words that mean slightly different things that are used in both countries, both for annotations. So if we can have that standardization, right, that this word always means this, then that really helps to clarify that communication. Then you're looking at a guided approach, right? So if you're working in digital condition reporting, you're not just considering the outcome, right? It's not just the end results, but it's also the use of the software as you go, right? So the use of a Word document as you go, or PDF generator as you go, is going to be a process that you need to have documented somewhere else, right? Because otherwise it's going to be done differently every time. Whereas if you're using a software that actually takes you through step by step, okay, you now need to do this. Now you need to add this. Now this information needs to be included, right? By having that guided approach, right? With the instructions in there, even for those who might be used to doing things slightly differently than you are, you can have everyone on the same page again with that clear communication. And then multimedia, especially video. So if you're looking at a piece that moves in some way, right? Whether that's moving in terms of putting it together, like installing it, or moves in terms of it actually is a piece that moves, as a part of its, artistic function, then if you're documenting that with pictures, you're missing out on an element there of communication, right? And you're maybe not being as clear as you could be. So for example, if piece A has to slot into piece B, and that's something that's actually quite tricky to do, okay? And all you're doing is just showing pictures of piece A and piece B, then you're missing out on the opportunity to actually show, okay, this is how these two pieces get put together, right? Or this is how this particular tool is used in order to put these two pieces together. And then in the end, once something's been installed, if it's something that moves as part of its artistic function, then what does it look like? What is it supposed to look like once it's done, right? And can that video be included? Is it a really large work that if you were just to take photos of it, and it would be difficult to gain context, right? So if you're working, let's say, with a really large 3D sculpture, and you just take close-up photos of the different damages, so you have 10 photos of the different damages, and you have those close up, knowing where those are on the piece, if the piece is 6 foot tall, that adds additional risk, right, on the other side, because they may think that, oh, the scratch is in the upper left corner, but actually it's in the upper right corner. And so you have to use more descriptive language when you're doing those annotations. But if you actually do a video where you're walking around the piece and you're pointing out where you took all of those photos, right, again, you're improving your communication levels and you're making it so that everyone is on the same page, right? And you're reducing your risks. And lastly, you have, for team efficacy, you have the question of future access by future team members of records. So number one, is that future access secure, right? So is that something that they won't be able to change? So it happens, right, where things get scratched, things get damaged. Can future team members just update the condition history trail and not actually edit documents that that are kind of the central document for that piece, and you wouldn't be able to tell, right? You wouldn't want that to happen. Then you have the audit trail. So future access, you want to make sure that when future team members or other institutions are editing or making updates or adding information to your condition reports, that who's doing it and when and from where, right? So if someone's making notes onto a physical document, yes, they're going to put a signature at the end, but can you read it in 4 years' time, right? When that work is going out again? Maybe not. Are you, did you remember who that other person was who was doing it on the other side? Do you even remember who on your team did the condition report, depending on how you mark things now, right, within your institution? Instead, can you have unique user logins that allow you to have an audit trail that is valuable, not just for you to be able to know who did what when, and to know when things happened and maybe why things happened, and to figure out when damage could have occurred. Also, if you're looking at your shipper, right, so you can know before and after when your shipper updates reports in a digital condition reporting system like Artcheck. And then future access for insurance claims. So you want to make sure that your insurer has the best information that they can in order to make sure that a claim is accepted. So again, we've talked about, right, cybersecurity issues can actually cause a claim to be denied. But in addition to that, you also want to make sure that your insurer has enough information to be able to approve your claim, right? So they need to be able to know who caused it, and to know that, in some cases, that it wasn't you. So for example, let's say it was your shipper that damaged the piece. If there's no record of condition reporting that's done, right, in between you touching that piece and the shipper touching that piece, right? If there's no condition report that's done on the other end in a way that is shown clear in time, right? And and who's doing it, then your insurance claim may be denied, right? So you want to make sure you're kind of making the best uh, chance you have at having a successful insurance claim. So I'm now going to put this form into our chat here. So I know that was a lot of information that I just gave you. We are, of course, going to send out the recording of this. If you would like to have a chat with us about any of these things and how you can mitigate risk for cybersecurity, for sustainability, for staff efficacy, more than happy to have a discussion with you about that, how you can move forwards in reducing risk in any or all of those areas. So if you click on that link, there's actually a form there that you can fill in that will get you in touch with one of our team members who will be able to have a conversation with you about that. And you can even put into the form any specific questions or any specific topics that you'd like to discuss with us. But of course, we have a little bit of time now. So if you have any questions about anything we've talked about, please go ahead and shout out in the chat and I will answer. From experience, not every venue has reliable Wi-Fi in all areas where checking is done. Hanneke, you are exactly right. 100% yes. And so that is why ArtiCheck actually has offline capability. So that's something that if you're interested, we can talk to you about specifically for our digital condition reporting solution. But as long as you have an iPad or an iPhone at your institution that you're using ArtiCheck on, then you don't need to have Wi-Fi at all. Yes, it was sent to just hosts and panelists. So just make sure when you click on sending a comment, it just goes to everyone. So this is the question, sorry. From experience, not every venue has reliable Wi-Fi in all areas where checking is done. And so I was just saying that you're right, and this is a big issue. And so I think a lot of institutions, the go-to is to then, do things physically by hand, but there are other solutions for that, and there are other ways to mitigate risk around that. Anyone else have questions or comments that they'd like to bring up about something that I've gone over today? Anywhere in the realm of cybersecurity, sustainability, team efficacy, or something else? Like I said, I know it's a lot of information at once. So if you come up with any questions after you've gone over the materials a bit, after you've looked at the recording, you can send in a form and have a chat with us. I definitely recommend, if anything is kind of pinged a warning bell in your mind when I was talking about it, then we're more than happy to have a conversation. A really big part of kind of our ethos at ArtiCheck is making sure that institutions are supported when, even if you decide that right now is not the time that you are going to be using something like ArtiCheck, having a conversation with us about how you can mitigate risk, right, is something that, we're more than happy to do. And so if you want to just submit that form and start the conversation there, then you can do that. I feel like some insurances prefer the courier being present. Is that true? And what's your experience? This is a great question. So in actuality, there are insurances tend to go with what the museum sees as best. But when they're sort of asked in a, let's say, a kind of neutral setting, they tend to say the more documentation that they have, the better. So it's not necessarily even that you may not have a courier, right? you may have a courier there part of the way, or you may have a courier, may have what's called bookend couriers, where you have a third party courier on the other end, which still saves carbon and cost. But you are documenting using photos and videos with that courier, right? And so then the insurance has that additional documentation and is able to more easily complete your claim and approve your claim. But yes, we're actually, working with insurers now to kind of remove the need for these things. So, for example, one of them is that sea freight is something that's not been insured for a really long time, right? For us, it's the invention, right, of insurance and sea freight because of the concerns around how long artwork isn't in sight, right? It's kind of not in sight of someone who has professional experience dealing with artwork. And so what we've done is actually we've worked with insurers, and we worked with some of the top insurers and top shippers in the world to establish a set of guidelines that actually allows sea freight to be insured. And so if you were to use Virtual Courier in our system and use the sea freight function, then you actually would be allowed to insure via AXA. You'd be allowed to insure your artwork moving via sea freight. And that saves carbon. It's like a 97% carbon reduction from air freight. So there's a lot of different ways that you can kind of look at things. Well, thank you to everybody for joining us today. And of course, like I said, if you'd like to have a chat with us about risk management in general, please, I recommend everybody to sign up via that form so we can get you booked in. We can talk about your specific needs. And we're happy just to have a chat about risk management. And then if you have any specific questions, you can put them into that form as well. But yeah, we can very much talk about your specific situation and what you're doing with condition reporting right now and how you can reduce risk with that condition reporting, whether that ends up you being, using Articheck or perhaps taking some intermediary steps before that. So thank you to everybody for joining today. And I hope to have some discussions with a few of you soon. Thank you. Bye, everyone.